welcome to Painting with Ryan. I'm Ryan, and this week we're going to have a lot of fun with another online art class, specifically an acrylic painting landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it and make something special together. So we're going to begin here today by taking our 1-inch flat-headed brush, and then we'll dip just the bottom third of it in some water. We're doing this to help extend the wet life of our paint. That water will work its way into the acrylics and allow them to be wet for a significantly longer period of time, making our larger blends significantly more easy. With that, I'm now going to grab some cerulean blue and about an equal mixture of titanium white. This is going to be our first attempt for rendering the color in the sky. That said, when I do go to apply it on the reference photo, I realize it's a little bit too dark. So now I interject more titanium white into that mixture. At this point, it's about 2-to-1 in terms of white to blue. And this, as you can see, it looks absolutely spectacular. So we're now going to take this mixture and we're going to start applying it to our canvas. I always like to start with the sky in our paintings with the furthest subject. That way you can build your other subjects, things in the middle ground, things in the foreground, on top of it, and expand over time that way. It's a very natural way of going about things. It means that later on you don't have to paint the sky around a very detailed palm tree, and it's also a great way of getting started because it lets you enter the painting with something relatively easy. It ensures that if you're a little bit rusty, you do get to, become reacquainted with that pigment and the application process in general. With that said, as you can see, for the most part, when I apply that paint, I apply it in a bit of an X-shaped pattern. That way I can stretch it from top to bottom, left to right, and then once I have it all in the way that I really want it, I move over with a bit more of a soft horizontal stroke. And I do this very purposefully because once you have that paint on there, you don't want all of these brush strokes that kind of make it look potentially messy, and by moving horizontally, you give it a very uniform look, and by using a very soft touch, generally you alleviate a lot of those markings that you get when you are just lathering that paint on initially, because you are smoothing it all out. And when you apply a lot of pressure with your brush, generally you push paint to both the left and right hand side of the bristle, and we don't want to do that here, right? Because then you do have these streaks, you do have these lines, and I think when a lot of people are beginning, that is an issue they have. They just apply too much pressure with their brush in those final layers. With that, we are now moving a little bit farther down in the painting, and here you can see that things are getting a little bit brighter. This was very much intentional. Again, I just incorporated about another half of titanium white into that blue, and this is fantastic because we're now crafting a very soft, very subtle gradient in the sky. This is what creates depth when you wrap light around a subject, when light changes a subject, and that's true for the sky as well. So as you can see, the bottom, the horizon, it's a little bit brighter, it's closer to that titanium white, and then we blend up into something that is still very much a bright blue. It's worth noting, it's not a dark blue in any area here. Just because you are building a gradient and a contrast doesn't mean that it needs to be a hyper established contrast. It doesn't need to be very dark and very light. You can have two things that are both quite light as long as they do have a little bit of variance there. And this is exactly what we're doing. So after that, I am just going to clean off my brush, make sure that I don't have any excess paint. So when I go back and do my second layer, as you can see here, I always like to do 2 layers of the backgrounds. It does end up looking really quite nice. With that, on to step 2. So we're going to begin with step 2 here by looking at our reference photo, seeing that subtle cloud, and then grabbing a smaller round pointed brush. This one is about 1/4 of an inch, and it's fantastic because it has a sharp point for detail, but also a round edge for softer applications. With that, I'm now going to place my palette on top of, or right beside my reference photo. We are going to grab quite a lot of titanium white, and then just a hint of primary blue, maybe just a hint of our Mars black as well, because when you are working with titanium white and the blue, you're going to get something that is fairly saturated, and I do want the cloud to be a little bit less saturated than the sky. So here you can see that I am blending up into that sky. I can see that variance, that difference, and then when I bring it down into the cloud, I say, oh, you know what? That's getting significantly closer, but it's a little bit too bright. So from there, I say, how do we make it darker? We add a little bit of Mars black. I throw that into that mix, and that right there blends perfectly into the reference photo. So with that, I am going to head over to my canvas. I am aware of where the cloud is meant to be. If you kind of lose that, you can go back and redraw it. In that painting process, I wasn't afraid to paint over a lot of my initial drawings, and I would heavily implore you to do the same, because you don't really ever want a subject to end up being too big because you were afraid to get too close to those edges when painting your background. You'd much rather repaint that subject in a little bit later and actually make it the size you want it to be. With that said, I'm beginning my application process at the top of our cloud, and then I blend downwards by holding the brush at an angle and letting the edge of it work in that very soft application. I am working in circular movements here. That way, if you still do see a little bit of that application, a little bit of that texture in the paint, it does look more fluffy, it looks soft, and you do end up with something that has a bit of character that resembles that of a cloud. Now here, I'm going back in. Again, I like to do at least 2 layers for everything. So I'm heading back to the top of the cloud, the area that's going to be receiving the most light. I'm working that highlighted application on, and it's not actually a highlighted application. It is the same pigment we worked on previously, but because we are now building layers and we don't see that blue showing through, you see more of the innate natural color that we mixed. And I'm yet again blending downwards. We're using the tip of that brush, that sharp edge, to craft the top. Then again, we hold the brush on a bit of an angle, and then we work in with those rounded strokes. As you can see here, blending it downwards, very soft, very subtle. You do want to ensure that in this process your brush is quite damp. You don't want it to be wet. You never want your brush to actually be wet, but by ensuring that it's quite damp here, we have an opportunity to continuously move that paint for a longer period of time. We're not kind of grinding the brush into the canvas. We are very much just softly moving it down subtly over time. However, if you add too much water, you may find that it kind of starts to rip off the paint. If that happens, don't worry about it. Just let the paint dry and then go back into it 5 minutes later. With that, here I am starting to craft 2 other clouds, and I'm doing so purposefully from a distance here because I wanted to show you just how subtle they are. If you're up close, it might be significantly more noticeable, but back here you can see a thin one in between, and then we have another one at the bottom. They all kind of follow the same angle and trajectory, but they are all different clouds. So here, jumping back into it a bit closer so you can see those details, and that's something we will do quite a lot in this lesson. We'll paint very close to the subject, but we'll also paint very far away, because realistically, when you look at a painting, you're not going to be 1 foot away from it. You're going to look at it from another side of the room, and it's important to recognize what it looks like from a distance so you can keep things balanced appropriately. With that, we are, yet again, going back in to the top of our clouds, and we're applying that highlight with the sharp tip. Then we are blending down as we tend to do. You can also make these slightly brighter or darker than one another. Diversity is an incredibly important thing in painting. We want them to be cohesive, but again, you can take liberties if you want something to have a bit more light. Perhaps one cloud is below another, it's going to be a little bit darker. Just different things to take into consideration. But here I am just blending that down, heading over onto the other side, and doing exactly more of the same. We're now going to jump into step number 3, which is applying the base layer to our ocean. But before we do that, I'm going to apply a little bit of tape here to the canvas so we can craft a very sharp, very fine horizon line. This will ensure that when we're painting on that blue for our ocean, we're not going to move it up into that sky and we're not going to have a series of bumps. It's going to be quite nice and straight. With that, here I am starting to mix the colors for that ocean. You can see that I started with some cerulean blue, a little bit of Mars black, and then I thought, you know what, it's too dark. So we added some titanium white, and that ended up being the correct color here for that very distant part of the ocean. This is, again, one of those techniques I just love doing, testing it actually on the reference photo. Here I'm using a clear palette. I just found this on Amazon. You don't have to do that. You could just test it again beside or directly on top of the reference photo. But with that, here I am mixing up a blue for the middle. And you can see that I'm now going to start using for the first time a little bit of a cadmium yellow deep hue. I'm using this color because it's going to mix with our blue. It's going to make it look a little bit more green, a little bit more teal. And that is, again, exactly what we want here. However, I look at that color, I say, you know what, it could be a little bit brighter. So we add in some titanium white. And when you're color mixing, that's always what you should be doing. You say, does this look the way I want it to? If not, what does it need? Does it mean more saturation, less saturation? Does it need to be brighter? Does it need to be darker? How does this color look with this color? So here I'm just doing, again, a little bit of a test on my palette. I mix up significantly more of that, and then I start heading in to the canvas, as you can see here. And this sharp edge of the brush is honestly fantastic because it does let you render very sharp lines like what we need here for the top of our horizon. However, we don't actually need it in this very specific scenario because we did go ahead and tape that area, just ensuring we were extra safe. But in general, that is one of the great applications of using a brush like this with a flat head. With that, you can see that I am starting to apply all of that pigment. I did not premix an excessive amount of the middle hue and value, so I'm just doing that now. You can look at that new color, it's a little bit more green, and I'm purposefully leaving off to the side just a little bit of that initial mixture. That way I know exactly what I'm mixing towards without actually having to go to the reference photo or essentially just guess with it. I always like to leave a little bit of those proper mixtures off to work beside and just kind of continuously evaluate with. That said, here we are going in, starting to apply that pigment, and it's looking extremely rough. But if you saw the thumbnail at the start of the video, I suppose when you were clicking onto the video, you'll notice that we do get it there. We do make it blend well. We do add the right details, and it all does come together. But an important thing to recognize with acrylic painting is that there are going to be just a myriad of very messy stages. And there's nothing wrong with that. It happens to all of us. Even when you've been painting for a decade, you're going to have these very awkward points in the painting. And you just need to believe in yourself, your abilities, and the fact that you will get that painting there. With that, here I am doing that blending process. Initially, I created a bit of a softer gradient. Now I'm using the brush and a little bit of a tap and drag effect. This is going to take some of the brighter pigments, bring them up into the darker areas, some of the darker pigments down into the lighter areas. And this is just going to create a little bit of texture, a little bit of movement in the water. It's going to make it more interesting, but in a very subtle, almost non-committal way. We're just testing the waters, if you will, and just ensuring that we have these patches that do look a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. Generally, when water rises up, when you start to get the hint of a wave, when you have that movement, the water is higher, you can have more light move through it, it then in turn becomes brighter, and that's essentially what we're trying to create at least the impression of. This is all fairly far away. We don't want to paint a hyper amount of detail in the distance because then the eye won't be able to focus on the foreground, and just naturally you don't see that much detail in the distance. So I'm trying to keep it fairly subtle. Again, it's a tap and then I drag it to the left or right. relieving pressure in that process. That way, we essentially end up having a bit of a softer edge, something that dissipates. It might become a little bit sharp, and it just looks like the natural progression of what a wave might look like. Here, I'm doing a bit of a tap without that drag, and I think that was actually a bit of a mistake there. I think it could have been better if I continued working in that movement. Here you can see that I'm going for that tap, and then I am trying to move it over to the left hand side. This again is meant to insinuate water that is rising, that more light is moving through, and perhaps it's a little bit of a wave that's coming down, partially creating a bit of a crash. Just so many different things that you can imply through a simple tap and a drag, as you can see here. But it's worth noting that we have been very much focusing on that central area. Don't forget to do the left and right hand sides when you do kind of separate the piece through a myriad of trees like we have off to the left hand side. That said, I'm not actually worried about that area because we are going to cover the majority, if not all of it, with a foliage later on. From there, though, I am adding in some additional white. This is, more so double than what we already had on the palette. And then I'm adding in just a hint of that cadmium yellow deep hue to create the next pigment in our, again, transition into the foreground and the water there. So I'm essentially applying this initially at that base, and then I move it up to the left and right hand sides. I do that little tap and drag, creating a gradient, but not a soft, clean gradient, one that's rather formed through the implementation of pattern. And that's something that's going to come up a lot throughout your painting journey. Recognizing initially how to do those soft gradients like we did in the sky, but then also letting go of kind of creating that hyper soft look to get something that has a little bit more texture, a little bit more style, a little bit more detail, like what we're doing right here. And now, with that, we do need some additional paint. So I'm grabbing some cerulean blue. I'm grabbing some of that cadmium yellow deep hue. This is slightly darker, as you can see, than our previous application, and that is what I want. So here I'm also adding in some extra Mars black, and I just want to create some additional variance in what we created. So now I'm taking essentially the blue that we used in the middle of the water, and I'm working that back in between some of the larger bodies and kind of open areas of the brighter application, and through that tap and drag effect, we are just creating this movement. Now, with step 4, we are going to dive in by taking a smaller round pointed brush. This one is about 1/8 of an inch, but like the last, the sharp tip will give us the ability to render some nice detail, and the soft edge will allow us to blend it all out. With that, here I am taking the highlight that we used for the foreground in the water, and I'm starting to implement some detail, predominantly with the application of these fairly similarly angled applications that drag the highlight of one horizontal application into the other. So we're either moving up or down, but we're essentially connecting all of these horizontal lines that we started to render with that 1-inch flat-headed brush. This is going to give it the illusion of these waves connecting and creating something a bit more cohesive. We're not going in with a hyper bright color. We are initially just working with what we had. That way, again, it's cohesive. We can work in baby steps. We can build it up in layers. We're not kind of over committing early on, and that's something I would heavily implore you to do, especially if you are fairly new to painting. I think one of the biggest mistakes artists make is they just apply so much color, so much contrast so quickly, but working in these very soft initial steps can be incredibly beneficial because it's that subtlety that's really going to sell your painting in the end and make it look natural. Here you can see I'm doing these very soft, very small applications just to insinuate waves in the background, and then I'm taking my finger and I'm wiping off that paint so it isn't as stark as it currently is. Alternatively, you could just mix a color that's slightly less stark and go in and apply it that way, but there are multiple ways of going about this, and I am a huge, always have been, always will be, advocate of finger painting. I just think it's very tactile. We always use our fingers, and we have so much control there. So if there's a way you can kind of incorporate that into painting, I think it's fun. With that, here, as you can see, I am going back to my palette. I'm mixing up a little bit more of that pigment, and I'm heading back in, kind of highlighting some of those areas, strengthening them, but I'm not using a brighter color. I'm just going over it with that same color, and the more you build that up, of course, the better it's going to look, because you're not going to have that other color showing through. That said, I then do want a bit of a brighter mixture, so I'm grabbing a hint of our cadmium yellow light hue. I'm grabbing quite a bit of titanium white. You can see the previous mixture off to the side there, and then with this, I am going to go in and start doing some highlighting on the tops of the waves that I do feel could use just a little bit more pop, and, just bring them to fruition here. So I'm starting with the applications in the foreground, the ones that are closest to us, because generally in the foreground, that's where you see the most contrast, the most saturation, and that's where you want the attention to be here. So I'm focusing on that, and then I will slowly move into the background, hopefully allow that paint to dissipate on the brush, become less and less prominent as we move farther back. But you can see that I'm just catching the tops of the highlights in the applications. We can do a little bit of a blend down if we want to, but we don't want to make it look too sharp. Right now, I think I'm very close to that edge, and this is one of those reasons why we really want to paint from the background here rather than up close, because if we were up close, we might continuously add contrast, we might continuously sharpen, do all of these things to make that area look incredibly good, but then run into the issue that when we step farther back, that area, it looks too detailed for where it is in the painting, and it essentially makes it so the midground is our foreground, and our foreground looks mundane because everything else is just as sharp and detailed. So that is one of those reasons, again, I really like to pull the camera back in these lessons so that you can see what it looks like when you're actually standing in a room, and ensure that you're not kind of overdoing it up close, because we've all been there 100 times. With that, I really like the detail here, and I don't want to overdo it, so I think that's where we will conclude with this step. We're now going to jump in to step number 5, and we're going to incorporate 2 new pigments. The first being a burnt umber, and then the next being a burnt sienna. The burnt umber is the very earthy, darker brown that you see that we are currently grabbing and moving down on our palette. We're then adding a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of titanium white, and I'm currently trying to render the color, or something similar to that of what you see underneath the water, for some very subtle, soft rocks that will have water on top of them. Now, I do want something a little bit darker. I do want something a little bit more saturated than what I actually see in that reference photo. And I also see some green underneath that water, rocks that might have some moss or some, different growths on them. And I want to, again, make these a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated, because when we add the blues on top of them, they're going to become significantly softer looking. They're going to have that blue, they're going to blend in more, and I want something a bit more stark initially. So this isn't something we can actually color match to the reference photo. This is something that we do, really need to get creative with, take some liberties. I have a bit of a dark and a light mix. That way we have a nice color for the base layer. Then we also have a color for our mid values, our mid hues in there as well. And as you can see, I'm also now mixing right beside that initial brown another variant of it, because I wanted to keep that there. I wanted to ensure that I was able to retain the initial color that I mixed, because I knew I really liked it. You don't always have to remix colors directly on top of the initial mixture, especially if you want to save it. With that, here I am applying this to where the water is going to stretch to. Past that point will be sand, and I am starting by just kind of working in that border, that edge, and then I will start working up into our water, which again we have previously applied in that last step. It's also worth noting that the burnt sienna is that warmer, rusty, more orange color, and I love to use that because it adds a bit of extra saturation, which the burnt umber doesn't have. It's nice and warm, which works great for these sunny scenes. So even in the darker areas, even in the desaturated areas, you still have that warmth, you still have a bit of really nice hue, and we're just slowly interjecting that into our mixture here to make it a bit more complicated and a bit more interesting. I'm also going over this application a number of times. As you can see, we're really building up those layers, and that's something I do implore you to do, because acrylic paints are inherently very semi-transparent. You can generally see the canvas through your first application, especially when you are also working with water. So you want to go and you do those layers a couple of times, build them up, make them nice and thick, and it really will make the painting look significantly better. I think that's actually normally an easy way of kind of figuring out who is a bit more new to painting. People who have been doing this for a longer period of time generally have those very thick applications and multiple applications at that. With that, we are now going to work into some of these mid values that we also mixed. You can see that I am deviating a little bit. This one's a little bit warmer than what I initially have, and I want to continuously deviate here. I don't want all of these rocks to look the same. So once I have a color, I apply a couple in this area, a couple in that area, a couple in a different area, and that way nothing looks too similar, and it doesn't look like there's almost a rainbow of rocks that changes colors through a gradient. They're kind of intermixed, they're different, and when you do see them through the water, it'll be a bit more interesting. It's also worth noting that these rocks are nothing special. It's just an obtuse small application here on the canvas. We are creating different shapes. We're kind of fitting them together like puzzle pieces. We have those darker values from that base layer kind of showing through in between a lot of them. None of them are really the same shape. They're all slightly different. And again, it's that diversity that's really going to make the subjects really quite interesting. Here I'm going into the tops of some of these rocks with just a little bit of extra highlight. I just interjected some titanium white into those mixtures, and this is essentially just going to give them slightly more depth, as now it looks like the light is hitting the top of the rock and then working its way downwards. With that, I am also going to interject some rocks here into the farther distance and kind of just have those stick out of the water in a couple of spots. Now, in the end, these aren't actually going to stick out of the water because we are going to cover it with more water, but I did want a bit of a transition and a bit of a progression into the background. I didn't want it to just be a single hard line of rocks like a wall and then essentially have it stop. I wanted to show that this actually continues out much farther, but because the water gets deeper, you don't end up seeing all of those extra rocks, all of that extra detail like you do very close up. So I'm finding lower points in the water, areas that don't have those highlights, and I'm just working them in. I'm also going back and doing 2 to 3 layers just to ensure that it's nice and thick. With that said, we're now going to let all of this dry, and then we can come back in and work on the water together. Now, once our rocks are fully dry, we are going to go back to that 1-inch flat-headed brush, grab quite a bit of cerulean blue, about an equal mixture of titanium white, then we'll grab just a small hint of our cadmium yellow deep hue. This is going to render a fairly bright blue, but I want something brighter than what we've used previously. So I'm grabbing yet again another large amount of white. This is now about 2-to-1 ratio with the blue, and I'm also going to start applying it to the canvas in a very similar manner to how we applied the highlights previously. We are working with these horizontal applications for the most part. They might have a little bit of a bend, they might have a little bit of a curve, but for the most part, they are these longer horizontal strokes that don't stretch all the way from one side to the other, but have these breaks. You do want these sharper ends and corners. So as you move to the left and right with them, you kind of relieve pressure, you lift that brush up, and you get this very sharp, nice edge. But we're creating all of these different little movements in the water. These are areas that, again, are kind of rising, catching a bit more light, and therefore look brighter. But underneath them, in the water, you do see the remnants of these rocks we painted, and it's going to give it a really nice look in a little bit. With that said, we are still just getting started with this application and the idea here. So once we have all of this implemented in the way we want, we are going to let it dry. And it's very important that we do let it dry for this next step. But once it is there, we're going to head back into our palette. We're going to mix up an even brighter blue than what we currently have. Again, I am mixing some extra paint, so I do need a bit more blue, a bit more of that yellow. But once we have this brighter mixture, I'm going to head over to my water, and I'm going to work a lot of that water into that mixture to the point where it's essentially like watercolor, and that it's very transparent, and we can treat this like a glaze. So now I'm going to take this new very transparent mixture that we have here, and I'm going to apply it to the foreground of our water right over our rocks. And as you can see, it adds this tint of blue, but it doesn't actually change any detail. We still have all of those sharp markings that we have. It's just essentially making everything very cohesive, connecting it all and making it fit together. Now those rocks really do look like they are underwater, and we have something quite nice. That said, again, make sure that those base layers are completely dry and that you're working very softly over all of this. That way you get a consistent application. Now, while we wait for that paint to dry, we are going to grab a fairly disposable brush, anything that has longer bristles and that is synthetic, and we're going to start chopping off all of the edges. The goal here is just to render an incredibly tiny end to our brush, something that can render just the sharpest details. Here you can see what I created in contrast with the brush that is, again, about 1/8 of an inch. And yes, you can go out and buy these, but they can be a little bit harder to find. They can be fairly expensive. So I wanted to show you that you can just take an inexpensive synthetic brush, cut it, and then have something very, very sharp for your detail work like this. And now what we're doing is we're going in with a blue that's actually just a hint brighter than our glaze, and we're applying this to the tops of our previously implemented markings that were fairly horizontal. This again builds up the highlight on top of them, the idea that it is water that is higher up, that it is catching all of this light. We're building this very small gradient, and we're going over it a couple of times. You can also tell that when I grab fresh paint from my brush, I get these very sharp, much more opaque applications, but the longer I kind of continue to work with that brush without grabbing fresh paint or water, the more soft it ends up looking, the more transparent. So that's actually a great thing to keep in mind while you are working on these areas. You might want to do the foreground with that really nice fresh application, but then as you start to move farther back into the painting, maybe you let it dissipate, maybe you don't go back to your palette, you don't grab any more pigment, and you just let that run out. That way those applications that are farther away look a bit softer, they don't look as stark, and the eye will move more so towards the foreground because that's where all of that detail is. With that, I am just kind of continuing here over to the left hand side of the canvas. This is going to look different for all of us depending upon the patterns we implemented in here, but you don't want to incorporate it on the tops of all of your blue highlights here. Just pick a couple here and there, and then we can take off that tape. Always a very cathartic process. We're also looking at it from a bit of a distance, and I think that from a distance it looks absolutely lovely. So we are ready for the next step. So now that we've applied our water, we are going to start moving into the sand, and I'm going to do so with about an even mixture of burnt umber and burnt sienna. Then I'm going to take some titanium white, start mixing that off to the side and slowly moving the two together until I get that nice bright sand color. And as you can see, we actually achieved that fairly quickly. However, I don't want that color. I want a darker color to act as our base layer, and so I am now interjecting a little bit of additional burnt umber, a slight bit of that burnt sienna, and even a little bit of our Mars black as well. If you look off to the left-hand side of the reference photo, you will see slightly darker areas of sand, which I'm now color matching to, and that is exactly what I want for this base layer. That way, when we apply the highlights afterwards, we can have a little bit of this darker color, this shadow showing through, and when we incorporate more of a granular texture, it'll actually look really natural. So with that, I'm now heading in to the actual canvas with the 1-inch flat-headed brush. This is now something that we've used in the sky, in the water, and the sand. It is incredibly versatile because of course it does have that nice sharp edge for crafting things like that of the detail in the water, but it's also just very large. It has a lot of surface area, it can carry quite a bit of paint, and so it's fantastic for blending out large areas like that of this sand, which really takes up about a fourth of the canvas. And it's also worth noting that this process right here, it's very much like the sky in that it's just a nice introduction into the painting process because we're not really doing much. We're not even creating a gradient here at this point. We are just mixing up a lot of this slightly darker sand mixture for the base layer and applying it. Though I do think it's always worth talking about the fact that just because, again, we are working with a darker sand color than what we initially mixed, it doesn't actually mean that the color we're working with here is dark. What we have here is still a bright color, it's just darker relative to what we were previously working with and color matching to. Also worth noting, we are covering quite a bit of the grass. Then, once all of that is applied, I do mix in quite a lot of that extra titanium white, a little bit of that burnt sienna, and go back to the color that was actually on the reference photo. Then I apply it to the middle of our sand, and I slowly blend out to the left and right hand sides as well as upwards. However, I'm doing all of this very softly, and as you can tell, I'm also letting there be this granular texture. This is actually just the tooth of the canvas, and this is generally what occurs when you don't put enough paint on the canvas or your brush is incredibly dry. Here in this scenario, I do want those semi-transparent applications, especially on the edges, so my brush is still quite damp, but I don't have that much paint on the brush, and I'm also being very light with my application. So when I do this, you can see that darker brown showing through quite a bit of these layers, and I think it's actually quite nice. It's a very quick and easy way to establish some detail early on. This won't be our only way of creating detail in the sand. We will go in with a different brush and a different technique, but this is definitely my favorite way of getting it started, building those base layers, and ensuring that we have something really quite nice. It's also worth noting that I am moving my brush in a bit of a rounded motion, just so I can get rid of some of those inconsistencies where some areas might be brighter or darker than others, trying to get that middle to feel very connected, and then again towards the edges and the back it does get a little darker. So once we have the base layer of our sand implemented there, we are now going to create some of our grass, and we're going to start with some cadmium yellow deep hue, then interject a small amount of burnt sienna to really warm it up, to make it feel like that sunlight is hitting it, is cooking it, and then we're also working in a tiny bit of our burnt umber to make it more earthy. Then, to desaturate it, we do add in some titanium white. This is also going to brighten that pigment, and then I start testing it over there on the reference photo, recognizing that it could be a little bit brighter. So we add more titanium white to it, we go back, we do more tests, and that is a mixture I actually really like. If you want it to be more saturated, if you want it to be more warm, you can interject more of that burnt sienna. But now I'm going to start mixing the darker grass, and this is actually going to be green, kind of what we'd assume grass to be. So I work in some cerulean blue that mixes with the cadmium yellow deep hue, creates this nice green, and then I do start to desaturate it because I look at the reference photo and I say, you know what, it's not a lush green. So we need some titanium white, we need some Mars black. Those two, of course, combine to make a gray. They desaturate what we're working with. The white is going to make it less dark, but I don't think that's an issue. And there you can see we have almost a perfect match. We're now going to take these two colors and start working them onto the canvas using our smaller round pointed brush. This one is about 1/8 of an inch, but again, that size doesn't really matter all that much. What matters is that you have a brush that you are comfortable with that works well on the size of canvas you currently have. We actually aren't going to be implementing a lot of detail with this brush right now, so again, the actual brush in this scenario doesn't matter all that much. Whatever really just makes you feel comfortable. I start by working in that darker base layer covering the white of the canvas. Then I go to our brighter pigment, and with vertical strokes I start tapping on all of these individual loose clusters of grass around the edging, trying to make that edge a bit brighter, a bit warmer. It works its way back into the shadow, and you can also see that I'm doing some stray pieces that don't necessarily connect directly to that larger cluster of grass. That's going to make it significantly more interesting and natural looking. If you did just kind of have a sharp edge all around, it would probably look pretty cartoony. So by interjecting those extra little pieces out there, you definitely add a lot of realism in a very subtle way, and we'll build on that in our next couple of applications. That said, I am going back and doing a couple of layers here because we are working with acrylics and they are inherently quite thin. Once I have that the way I want it to, though, we are going to switch over to our custom small brush. This one, again, it doesn't necessarily have a specific size because we did cut it ourselves, and we essentially just tried to make it as small as we possibly could while still having the ability to hold paint. And from there, we are going to grab that yellow. I mixed up some additional grass color that we kind of came to there at the beginning, and I'm working this around the edge and then back into the grass. This is going to stand alone. It doesn't necessarily just have to cover the green. You can stretch it out even farther, creating wider patches between grass, sand, and grass. But much like the blue water that we were working with, the detail, we want the majority of these very sharp, very saturated strokes more so in the foreground closer to us, and then as they get farther away, we let the paint dissipate on our brush, we let it run out, it gets more subtle because, again, we don't see that detail farther away. We see it in the foreground, and then our eyes just kind of lose us as we move into the distance. So here the markings are significantly less dark than what they were in the beginning. Here, though, we are now switching to the round pointed brush, again, the one that we used for the base layer, and I do want to use this one specifically here in this instance because I want that nice sharp point that it can render. We are going to mix up an in-between pigment. It's not going to be as dark as our base layer, but it's not going to be as bright as our very sharp applications in the foreground. And the hue itself is going to be a combination. It's going to be a green, but it's more of a muted green. I'm just tapping in some of this extra detail, leaving openings so you do still see that darker green in different portions. And this is just to show that you can build up grass through multiple brush strokes, through multiple textures. You can layer them, and when you do start layering them, that's when they start to work really well. I'm also doing this part right now from a distance because we're now working with 3 different colors in a very small area, and you don't want to have one really take control. You don't want to kind of overdo that contrast and that detail. So this is one of those areas where I did feel I wanted to paint from farther away. I wanted to show it to you from farther away as well. That way, when we were, looking at it from a bit of a distance in a room, it actually looked natural. Here, I did mix up a bit more of that yellow that we used around the outskirts, and I'm starting to implement it kind of, again, in the outskirts, but then move my way backwards, move my way in, and just create something that looks really quite nice. So now, in the distance, we have almost no detail with the dark grass, and then we have a little bit of detail that was done with the round pointed brush, and now we have a lot of detail closest to us with the smallest custom brush. So we're just building up that detail as we get closer to us, and now that I'm fairly confident with the transitions between them and how much detail I want in each area, I can get closer, I can work on those fine details, and that's what you're seeing happening right here. It's also worth noting that the application that I'm doing here is a little bit darker than the initial yellow. You can see that I am working some burnt sienna into it, some burnt umber, and that's because we are starting to move closer into the brighter area of sand where that yellow just wasn't going to stand out. They were two very bright values, and so despite the fact that they were different hues, different colors, they're going to visually mesh, and you're just not going to see that. So I decided to go with a bit of a warmer grass, something that, again, has been in that sun for quite some time. It's straying away from those greens, which aren't actually lush, but this is going to make them look a little bit more so just by comparison, by contrast, and that's definitely something you really start to love to work with the more you paint. Not necessarily implementing hyper-saturated colors, but introducing colors that are going to complement other colors. So despite the fact that they are more of a beautiful subtle color, they stand out more, and you don't have to kind of go overboard with that saturation. Again, that's something we'll talk about a lot throughout these lessons, but it's an important thing to recognize that you don't have to go in with so much vibrance, so much saturation. That subtlety can be something that is achieved, and you can have those subjects still stand out. Here, though, we are now adding some extra detail to our grass, going over those same initial applications, but with a bit of a highlight on the left-hand side. It is starting to bring them out a little bit more. It's adding some extra depth. It's creating some variance in them. Again, diversity, so important with really every element of painting, but I really like how this side is turning out. Now, something else you've probably noticed throughout this painting process is that for the first time in actually years, I'm using some sped up footage in this painting lesson. It's something that I actively try to avoid, but because we were working with so much detail, this lesson honestly could have been 10 hours of real time, and a lot of it was repetitive. So in scenarios like this, where I'm doing literally the exact same thing on the other side of the canvas, I thought I would show it to you so you can still see that process. You can, get something to visually remember it. You can copy it for your version, but you don't necessarily need to listen to me say all of it 2 or 3 times all over again, right? And again, make what could be, I think, a very condensed, informative 2.5-hour lesson 10 hours. So we are going to try this out. I would love to know what your thoughts are on it, though, in the comment section, because again, this format is different than what I'm used to. I'm doing a voiceover rather than talking in real time. Again, not something I've done in a number of years at this point, but I just thought we'd give it a try. I wanted to really up the production quality in these lessons here, and I just thought these were the proper first attempts, right? We may go back to talking in real time. I think that there are definitely benefits and cons to both styles, but I wanted to give you something a little bit different that we could really just try out, see how you're feeling about it. And again, I really do want to hear, especially from the people who have been following the channel for quite some time. So let me know in the comments how you feel about the added level of production, if you prefer more of a voiceover like this, or if you prefer when I talk in real time. I am more than happy to do either of them and, just make you the best lessons I possibly can. But with that, I do think that having multiple colors in the grass here really made this look quite nice. And here you have it at a distance, as if you are walking into the room, you're looking at it on the wall, and I think we are ready to move on to this next step, because I think that looks pretty great. So jumping back into this, we're going to take a little bit of a break from our greenery, and we're going to just sketch in everything that we lost when we painted in that sand. Here I'm just showing you a little bit of Conte. That's what I like to use to draw on canvas, as it does come off with water and it generally doesn't dilute pigment. With that, I am now going to start mixing the shadow color that you see at the bottom of my reference photo. I'm using quite a bit of Mars Black, quite a bit of our burnt umber, a little bit of titanium white, because again, I don't want it to be too saturated. And here you can see we have something really quite close. If anything, I think it could be slightly warmer, so I do interject that slight amount of our burnt sienna, and then I'm quite happy with it. So now I'm going back in with a round pointed brush. I believe this one here is about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm just using this because there are some larger areas of shadow in here that I am really going to want to fill. Might have taken too much time with the smaller version of this brush. That said, when you do go ahead and work through the details here, when you do go ahead and kind of solidify those edges, that is when you probably are going to want to switch to a smaller brush. This is normally how I like to approach painting and subjects like this. I fill in the body with a larger brush. I save that time, but I don't attempt to really refine all of my edges and corners with that brush. I recognize that that's a process that probably should be saved for a smaller brush, and so I kind of jump back and forth through, I think, a lot of the more recent lessons, that I've been working with a 1/4 inch and then 1/8 inch round pointed brush specifically for these types of scenarios. And I'm, again, not hyper focused on creating the best edging in this area. I am trying to get the general impression of it. I'm not trying to ignore it. I'm, still trying to work generally within those confines, but I'm not ensuring that every part of it is as perfect as it possibly can be, because it just isn't rational to do so with a brush of this size. So I'm just working my way through the areas that I can, and when I get to the very small, very finite areas that might be a little questionable to work on with this brush, I do try to go in with a very soft touch, so that way the bristles don't expand and I don't get a larger application. Here though, I have switched now to the smaller version, the 1/4 inch, and I am getting these smaller areas, trying to really refine some of those sharp edges. And now when we get to the really small areas, I do switch to that custom brush that we used previously. I'm also going to use this to create some shadows for our grass here over on the left hand side, and for the palm tree that we have on the left hand side. In this painting, the sun is coming from the top left, and it's always important to recognize where the sun is in relation to your subjects, because that's going to determine where your shadows are. Here I was quite lucky, the reference photo just visually showed me where that sun is. I didn't have to make that decision, but because of that, whenever you have an elongated vertical subject, something that stands up, stands tall, you know that it's going to have at least a bit of a shadow that's going to move to the right hand side. So I started with the grass as a kind of nice ease in. Now I'm going to work with the palm tree that we have here. It's loosely drawn, so I'm just kind of filling that in as I feel we need to with the smallest brush possible. So we're really jumping around and just using whatever is necessary. So we're now going to take a little bit of a break here from all of our detail work, and I'm going to mix some greens. I'm starting with the cadmium yellow deep hue. We're grabbing some of our cerulean blue, quite a bit of Mars black, and a little bit of titanium white. This should all amalgamate and turn into essentially what we used for the darker base layer of our grass. However, this time we're not actually going to be working on grass. We are going to be working on the base layer for our foliage. And I start mixing that up. I say, you know what? Looks a little bit too dark. So I grab some extra titanium white, I work that in, and that actually looks fantastic. So now that I have my darker base layer, I say, okay, let's start mixing more of a mid value, a mid hue. So off to the side, I grab some blue, I grab some yellow, some additional white. Remember, we want this to be quite a bit brighter than our last offering, and it does have some Mars black already mixed in there because our brush was not clean, so it does still have that diluted darker green pigment. And as you can see, we are very quickly finding a nice green, but you notice that it was a good representation of some of the greens in there, but not all of them. We're going to be working with a lot of different greens, a lot of different mixes, and this is something that you want to do in the foreground because it is very detailed. The eye can pick up on a lot of different colors, variants, subtle changes, so keep that in mind as we start moving forward. That said, throat's getting a little bit dry. I think we're going to take a little drink here. And, you know, this is something I actually mention in every painting lesson at some point. Make sure that you are staying hydrated while you're painting. Make sure that you are, remembering to eat. I know that it's so easy to forget about those basic things, just getting wrapped up in the process, but they are important. So if you haven't already and you're kind of working through this, make yourself a nice tea, maybe a coffee, get a glass of water, something to just ensure that you're staying healthy and keeping hydrated. So I'm going to have a little bit of water here. And we are feeling a whole lot better. So jumping back into this, you can see that I am just working on that base layer. Here I am now mixing with a little bit more blue, and my brush strokes are significantly more rough than they normally are. I'm not blending everything out to look extremely clean. I am trying purposefully to leave those in, and that's because they are going to be the implication of darker, very shadowed leaves kind of built into this larger piece of foliage. There I do go for a bit of a variance. I get it significantly more bright than I want it, so I grabbed some extra Mars black and we fixed that up really quickly. But it's a friendly reminder that you can take chances with acrylics. You can take artistic liberties. You can have fun with it. It's an incredibly forgiving medium. If you really mess something up, if you don't like it at all, it is okay. Just wait 10 minutes for it to dry, then paint over it. That's really something that's just so wonderful about this. It's incredibly forgiving, and one of the reasons I personally love working with acrylic paints. Here, however, we are now going to get a little bit closer. I am switching to the smaller round pointed brush. We were previously working with the 1/4 inch one. Here we're working with the 1/8 inch because we are working around some of these sharper edges. And all of these leaves are being crafted to kind of sit in different directions, right? Leaves don't all fall directly down. Some of them are more erect, some of them have different angles, and we want to ensure that it's quite diverse, that we have a lot going on there, and that the viewer doesn't kind of look at one patch of foliage and say, okay, I get it. I understand what's going on here. I can move on. I don't need to continue looking at this painting. We want it to be natural. We want to ensure that we have all of those fun little interesting motions in there. And so sometimes they're off to the right, left, up, down. And when I do this, I try to go in with a very, very soft touch of the brush. So you get this very sharp point, and then I apply a little bit more pressure with the brush. That expands the bristles, makes the brush wider. And then what happens is you get that larger body, and then you relieve pressure so that the end of that leaf kind of gets smaller again, and then you get this really nice organic natural shape, and you can continuously change the size and the shape by just applying more or less pressure in that process. Here though, I also added some extra little plants over to that far right hand side. They kind of look like a series of butterflies. That's how I kind of think about them. That's kind of how I went into it. Say, okay, that's how we're going to craft it. That's the look we're going for. So they're all just kind of stacked on top of each other, moving in not a perfectly linear movement, because again, we do want that variance. We do want it to look like there's a bit of a wind, it's blowing, and they're at different stages in their life, so they're different sizes, and we just want it to be that much more interesting. Here we are now jumping over to the left-hand side. We weren't done by any means with the foliage over on the right-hand side, but right now we are just focusing on building those base layers, and I do want that base layer to dry over on the right-hand side before we start implementing any of our detail. So while I wait for that to dry, I do go in over here on the left, and it's also worth noting that I'm letting the edges be a little bit brighter than the center to the bottom area. I want that to be a bit darker because you're just not going to get a lot of light in that area. Then up at the top here, we did interject a different type of plant over on the right hand side. Here we're going to do another different type of plant over on the left hand side to keep it interesting, and this one is going to be done like a lot of the palm trees will be later on. We're using that very small brush, and we're just working these incredibly fine, slightly slanted, slightly curved applications in there. They're creating some leading lines pointing up towards the tree, and then I'm going back in with our smaller round pointed brush, some extra paint. It's quite damp at this point, so the bristles rather are fairly condensed, and as you can see, we are now crafting something that's much more sharp. We started with those more broad strokes, just kind of trying to fill in the area. It was loose, it was organic, it was natural, and now we go in and we refine and we just try to clean things up a little bit. So from there, we're going to continue jumping around in the painting, and now I have an older, disheveled, synthetic flat-headed brush. And you can really use any flat-headed brush for this. I think synthetic ones work significantly better, but here I'm just peeling back my bristles so that I have all of these little points that I can dip in paint, tap on the canvas, and render just a myriad of incredibly small applications that I just wouldn't be able to create any other way. I would recommend using a brush anywhere between ½ an inch to an inch. Just make sure that it is something you are okay with kind of reserving for this purpose. That said, I don't want to actually mix any paint with that brush, because if I were to kind of start doing that blending process, it would condense a lot of those bristles. That's not what we want. So I'm mixing up my pigment here with the smaller round pointed brush, and I'm going to mix a slightly darker color for our sand, something quite similar to our initial base layer, because we're going to create a slight textured vignette around the painting using this. So as you can see, I took that brush, I spread that paint out throughout my palette. Now I'm going to take that new brush that we just kind of rendered ourselves. I'm going to get the edges, those tips, nice and full of paint, and then I'm going to tap this around the edges and outskirts of the painting. So here you can also see that I'm rotating the brush in the air in between each tap. That way each tap is quite different, but it is creating these incredibly subtle, small applications which do give us, from a distance, a bit more of that sand texture. And this isn't initially going to look perfect. It's something we are going to work on over time, and we are going to go over this again with an even brighter highlight application as well, which will make it feel significantly more natural, again, a little bit later on in the painting process. But this is just another part of kind of getting to that finished area. And again, we're always regardless of how long we've been painting for, we are always going to have some awkward stages, and I think this will look a little bit awkward, especially if you use slightly too much paint, which we all do once in a while if we don't kind of peel those bristles back. So do try to make sure that you don't have much paint on the brush. Do try to make sure that you do have those bristles extended as much as you possibly can, but recognize that if it doesn't work out perfectly the first time, it is okay, because we are going to go back and do some fixing a little bit later on. Here I am speeding up the footage because I did do this for quite some time, really not changing my application at all. But as you can see, I'm going over a number of areas a number of times. It's starting to make the sand look darker as a whole. And now it's time to start having some fun in a different direction. So I'm taking my titanium white, I'm taking some of that burnt umber, even more titanium white, because we do want this to be quite bright, in the very least as bright as our highlighted layer for the sand, and I'm going to start applying this more so in the center of our sand, and then I move it out towards those outskirts. That way we have something that blends in quite well with the middle, and then it creates more of that textured gradient to that left-hand side. We don't necessarily just have a hard stop with bright sand to then that darker tapped on sand. There's a lot more of a movement, and again, just a natural feeling with it. That said, you almost saw that I went back in with that older kind of disheveled brush to do the mixing. Then I was like, oh, you know what? That's not what we do here. If that does happen, what I would recommend is just washing your brush really well, drying it incredibly well, and then going back and just kind of going at the process in the proper way. Because if you do end up doing that blend there, it will condense the bristles, and you also want to make sure that the brush is entirely dry before you start peeling those bristles back, because water does condense the bristles on brushes, and we don't want that to occur, especially in this instance here. But it's interesting because we normally keep our brushes damp because while it does extend the wet life of our paint, it also keeps those bristles really tight and ensures that we do get those very sharp, great applications. That said, we'll have an excellent example a little bit later on in this episode with a fairly custom fan brush that I had some fun making. That said, here you can see that that transition is starting to look absolutely gorgeous. Like I said, went through a little bit of an awkward stage, but we were able to kind of get back to that nice transition. That center area of the sand now looking quite a bit brighter, and as we do take a step back, we do have that feeling of texture, but it's not too much, and I really like what we ended up with. At this point, I think it's safe to assume that our base layers of foliage have fully dried, and now we can start heading in to more of those mid values and hues. So here I'm starting off very simply, grabbing some of our cadmium yellow deep hue, some of our cerulean blue, a little bit of our titanium white, and I'm mixing up a fairly desaturated but bright green here. I'm also going to throw in a little bit of Mars black. That way we do have something that's a bit more subtle. I don't want to start again with anything hyper saturated, and that is something I actively do try to avoid, especially in these beginning stages. The less saturated your initial layers are, the more room you have to grow and add to them, the more opportunity you have later on to make subjects pop. So that's essentially what I'm trying to do here. I'm also now mixing a secondary green for some of our other pieces of foliage here, because when you look at that, there are a lot of different colors. There are a lot of different shades and values. Here I'm going for more of a yellow one. I'm just color matching in a couple of different spots, seeing, okay, are these three initial values and hues enough to get us started? And I think so. I think they're all different enough, they're interesting, and as long as we space them out accordingly, we can have a fairly diverse looking set of foliage fairly quickly. So here I am starting off by trying to craft some of those edges. Again, when you first grab paint, that's when your brush is probably the most damp, when you have the best ability to render sharp edges. So I'm going to more of the prominent points in the painting and just ensuring that those are as cleanly applied as they can possibly be. We are going to build up these leaves later on. We're going to add some extra depth to them. We're going to kind of wrap some light around different portions. But for now, what we're just trying to do is find areas that aren't directly connected to apply these pigments, and then we'll kind of bounce back and forth between each color. My application in painting these leaves here is fairly similar to what it was initially when I was working on the edging and that silhouette effect. So I'm going into it with, again, a very, very light touch of the brush, almost no pressure at all, and then I start to apply more pressure. I expand my bristles, and then I relieve pressure as I get towards the end of the leaf. That way it ends on more of a sharp point yet again. This isn't always the case. Sometimes I'm going to want the base of the leaf to be a little bit bigger, as you can see with some of these, giving it more of a rounded edge, and that just means kind of keeping on more pressure towards the end as you are lifting that brush off, but kind of continuously playing with that is going to make the painting look significantly better. And if you can kind of end the back of the leaf with a very hard edge, it'll almost look like the leaf is bending and that the front part of the leaf, the tip of it, is kind of out in front of the back part, and it's just overlapping that. So you get this extra depth in there, extra neat effect, and just a good way of keeping your leaves diverse, especially when you have to paint hundreds of them. And I say have to. It's a real pleasure. I love painting leaves like this. I think it's a very cathartic process, and you can see that I'm just taking my time, enjoying the process, working in what is now the third or fourth application in a slightly different hue or color. None of these at this point are all that saturated or bright, and now I am going to do this from a bit more of a distance. We had our fun up close, we recognized the detail that we wanted, and now we can work from a bit farther away. Here I am working with a bit more of a yellow and a bit more of a saturated application, and I'm only allowing myself to do this because I am farther away and I can see how it works in contrast with our grass, making sure that I'm not kind of going overboard with that, because again, when you're painting very close and when the camera I think is very close to the canvas, it's easy to kind of deceive yourself and say, oh, I could add more color, I could add more contrast, I could do this, I could do that, and then just not have it fit when you step back. So just something else to consider. Here we are working on that plant over to the right hand side. This one is very individual in the painting, it is nowhere else, and that does keep it interesting, but it does contain very similar colors, so it doesn't just stand out and look awkward. That said, here I am working on the left-hand side areas first, and again, these are kind of like a butterfly shape, very small. You essentially have the wings that are sticking out to the left and to the right. They get a little bit smaller as you move inwards, and it's just an easy way of kind of visualizing the subject here and what you want to have it end up looking like. I'm also trying to make one of the sides a little bit different in color, because while it is the same plant, light is going to be hitting it slightly differently. In this, I do have the side on the left a little bit brighter right now. The side on the right is a little bit warmer. It's a little bit darker, though you could definitely invert that depending upon how you wanted these to kind of be facing the light. You do have a lot of room for artistic liberty in here, or you could really just follow the reference photo. That said, I have been using the reference photo a lot in this painting lesson, and while it's how I personally like to paint, I think it's worth noting that you really don't have to. You can kind of color match with your eyes. You can take those artistic liberties. You can completely change the color palette and have fun with it. Don't feel like it is handcuffing you to a certain idea. Things like the reference photos and the trace boards, they're there to aid you. They're there to help you to make the process more enjoyable, not to kind of lock you into something. So please feel free to, continue to paint the way you want to paint and take those liberties. You don't need either of them. They are simply there to help if you feel you would like said help. So with that, here I am extending these up a little bit higher, and I think a mistake I'm making here is that I'm actually starting with a brighter color. I don't have that base layer in there, so they look very thin, very flat. I realize that quite quickly. I mix up a darker pigment, and then I start applying that on top of these applications here. Builds it up, and already it looks so much better. It is a true testament to just how powerful, how impactful those darker base layers can be. And with that, I'm now actually taking that darker pigment and I'm just working it back in between some of these little leaves here, trying to, again, separate things, add in some shadow, more so in the middle, because that middle area is going to be receiving the least amount of light if both of these two leaves are kind of surrounding it. That said, I'm quite happy with that area. Once all of our newly implemented plants have fully dried, we are going to start working with a brand new color, that being a primary red, and we're going to make a nice little set of berries. This is actually going to be the only area in the painting we're going to be working with this red, and that's something I generally advise against. Normally you want to kind of work it into 2 or 3 different areas, actually generally odd numbers, so 3, 5, 7, etc., just so that the eye kind of bounces around in a very organic way. But these are going to be very subtle, and I think it's going to make the painting look extremely natural, because in real life you don't always see colors in sets of odd numbers. It's something that we do to artificially kind of enhance visually our compositions. So, one of those different decisions you can make here. I am just following that reference photo, but I'm starting with those little taps. I'm using a mixture of my primary red, my Mars black, my titanium white. I'm using the smaller round pointed brush and just using the point of that brush to get that very sharp application. And of course, those initial applications are a little bit darker, as you can see here. Then I go for a brighter application on the left hand side, because again the light is coming from the left. It's going to illuminate the left hand side of all of our subjects, and it's going to make them look a little bit brighter. So despite the fact that these subjects are as small as they are, we can still create some really nice detail in there and have them connect to the rest of the world and fit in through that same lighting scheme. You can also mix up a darker red later on and just apply that to the right hand side of them as well to kind of create some of that extra depth. Here, however, I am just kind of creating additional base layers so that I can create more highlights and add to them. I generally like to start with very few, and then I slowly add until I feel like I have just enough. I also do them in slight clusters, but try to keep it continuously changing and organic. But that right there is enough for me. It's just a good addition to the piece. Now, our next step here is going to be adding a lot of detail into the foreground and our foliage. We're going to begin by creating some additional little leaves. However, these are going to be quite dark. These definitely have more Mars black in them. We are straying away from the yellows in our mix. We are allowing them to be a bit more cool, so we do have more blue in them. And these are going to be implemented throughout the larger body, the silhouette of that base layer that we initially created. So there you can see that I was kind of jumping around with them. Here I am trying something that's a little bit brighter. I wouldn't go with anything that stands out more than this, but this does act as a nice transitionary color between the top area and what will be the bottom area. So we've started with some random implementations of that. Then we say, okay, let's get to be a little bit darker. We add some extra blue, we add some extra Mars black, little bit of extra yellow to keep it warm. But now we have a nice in-between with the darker color that we kind of tested with the transitionary color, and we just kind of threw that in a couple of different areas. Now, this is something that, much like the top of our foliage, we want these to all be going in different directions. We can have them overlapping, but a lot of them here I'm going to have kind of moving downwards. So I'm starting with my brush kind of up at the top of where I want my leaf to be, and then I move downwards on one angle, kind of to the left, kind of to the right. I do a little bit of a dip down, and then I relieve pressure as I get towards that bottom area so that I get that nice sharp application. I'm also just trying to be as random as I can be moving throughout these areas of space, because subconsciously you can kind of start doing the same thing. You kind of inherit this idea of a technique or what something looks like, and if you continuously do it in the same area, it's very obvious. But if you jump around a lot, you can kind of mix up those similar applications, and that gives you time to say, okay, you know what, I need to change this, I need to do something different, it provides you that extra safety net and opportunity. So if you're someone who finds that a lot of your natural and organic subjects look very visually samey, try not working, left to right, top to bottom, etc., etc. Try just working very randomly throughout this as I am here, and do so with different hues, with different values, all of that. Then, once we have our base layer fully implemented, I am switching to one of those cut smaller brushes, and as you can see, I'm creating essentially what is going to be the very large, longer stems of a big plant that we have. Now, I do try to keep these all moving in their own unique way. Some of them bend more so than others. Some of them are more long than others. Here you can see that this one actually doesn't make it all that high, and then it moves off of the canvas where one of them almost sticks completely upwards. It again is that diversity that you really want. And the applications that I'm doing here are really just kind of test applications, figuring out how I want these next kind of pieces to move throughout the piece. But once I have that, I am going to start creating these little offshoots for these larger, again, stems that we have. So these are going to move off to both the left and the right hand side. This is something that's going to look fairly similar to our palm tree leaves. So we have that cohesive look, but this is going to look significantly less full to those. So here, again, I go to the middle of that initial application. I move off to the left, I move off to the right, and in that process, I try to let these get smaller and smaller. I want them to essentially be the largest when they meet at the stem, and the sharpest, the most refined, the most petite as you move towards the edges. That way they look sharp, they have more of that body in the middle, and it just visually makes a lot of sense. Here I am starting to move down, and something you'll also probably notice pretty quickly is that not all of them are going to move directly in one area. Sometimes they move up and then I have them kind of droop back downwards. That again makes them imperfect, but it makes them natural and organic, and something that is significantly more interesting. This will be much more visually notable a little bit later on in the painting process when we do start to work with more of our highlights and really start defining some of these pieces that are very much in their early stages, because while I think that we are on the right track, we are still just building that base layer. Just because it isn't a very dark value like that of our initial silhouette for the foliage doesn't mean that it can't be a base layer and that we can't build highlights on top of it, making it look much more three-dimensional. Because right now it's going to look pretty flat. It's going to look interesting because of course we have just all of these different movements, but we don't have a range of values. We don't have a real range of colors. I am trying to make this one a little bit brighter because it is higher up. It'll catch a bit more light. It isn't necessarily fully in the shadow of the plants that are right behind it. And so here I do start with a bit of that brighter color, again working on the left and the right hand side. There's a bit of a curve to each stroke as well, and you don't always have to start at the stem. You don't always have to start farther away. It's very much dependent upon how you personally like to paint and where you feel you are getting the best results. Here, however, we are now moving closer into the canvas. I have a slightly brighter mix here on my brush, and you can see that I am using that again in the stems and the bodies of these plants. This is going to be used to make it look a little bit larger, a little bit more bold, so that it does stand out from the individual leaves on the right and left hand side. So we're adding actual size to it, but we're also adding highlight that'll stand out and make it a bit more distinct. That way we have different areas of the plant and it doesn't all look like it's blending together. It looks more natural. Here though, I am starting to work some of those highlights around the top areas, letting it dissipate as we move farther down, because again, that top area is higher. It's going to receive slightly more light than that bottom area, and it will in part cast a shadow on itself. So the bottom areas, you want to keep them a bit more subdued. You don't want them to be as saturated. You don't want them to be as bright. And that is something I'm going to be working to really achieve throughout this process. That said, I do want this to look really, really nice. It is in the foreground. It is kind of front and center in the painting. And so it's something that has an opportunity to have a lot of detail, saturation, contrast, unlike everything that we had in the mid and the background. Because, again, the farther away something is, generally the more subtle it's going to look. This is when you really have that fun opportunity to make it look quite special and stand out. So that is exactly what we are going to be doing through just a plethora of layers here. You can see I'm going back up to the top of this area over on the left-hand side because that area is going to be receiving a bit more light, and then I let that paint dissipate as I move down it. You can definitely see a gradient from that more yellow highlight down to the more blue-green at the base, and we'll also start interjecting some extra just little pieces throughout here, trying to fill them out. Again, like a lot of these processes, I like to start with a minimal amount and then I slowly add to it. I don't kind of do 100 initially. I'll start with, 25, and then we'll add 10, and then we'll add 10, just until we get to something that we actually feel we really like, because it's much easier to add more than it is to take them away. Here I'm also adding one that's kind of off far to the right hand side, just little hints of it showing up there, and I like that because it does show that it's more of an expansive world. There is something else. It gives the mind subconscious curiosity as to what else is out there and just how far this expands, what this area looks like as a whole, right? So little techniques like that can play some fun subconscious games. And then once I have all of that in there, I'm switching to a smaller brush, again one that we crafted. It is very damp because I want all of my bristles extremely condensed. I want the sharpest line possible. I'm using as minimal amount of pressure as I can possibly incorporate here, and I'm working on these very small little branches. They do get larger as you move towards the bottom because branches naturally get smaller as they move upwards. That is how they grow. That is how they naturally exist. So also just something to consider. This middle area is also going to be a bit more thick than that outer area, and that's nice because it kind of gives it this base in this area that's very definitive. I also try to look for other areas throughout the foliage that I can kind of just put a small branch in. That way it doesn't look like it only exists in this single area. Of course, these branches do hold up all of this foliage, and so if we can find different areas to work them in, it will look quite nice and natural. Just try to make sure that you are always evolving and that they're consistently changing. Again, this is something you might want to go in and draw first with a piece of Conte with maybe a woodless colored pencil. I generally advise against drawing on finished paint with a charcoal or a graphite because generally it can bleed into your pigments, change and dilute those colors, make them a bit muddy, and just make the process significantly more difficult. But in general, I find woodless colored pencils and a Conte to be the best options. That said, once I have all of those applications in there, I do mix up a little bit of a brighter brown, and here we are applying this highlight to the edges of our tree here, all of these little branches that we've been very carefully crafting. Here you can see I'm dodging one of those leaves so it looks like it's working behind an area and then it comes out another. Definitely gives it this extra element of depth, and it's so subtle. For the most part, you are going to want to make those applications on the left hand side of the vertical branches, and then if there are any branches that are a bit more horizontal like we have on the left, you're going to want to put that highlight on top because that's how the sun's going to be coming down. It's going to be coming down from the left and from the top. So anything vertical gets that highlight on the top, anything anything vertical gets that highlight on the left, and then anything horizontal gets that highlight on the top. I'm also now moving those highlights down in between some of our other foliage, which I think really brings this whole area together, makes it feel so much better, and I just love how this is turning out. This was one of those stages in the painting that made me realize that, you know what, this is going to be something special. I'm really going to love this. And I think in the end, in terms of bright daytime warm scenes you just want to explore and relax in, this is definitely one of our absolute best. With that, here I am continuing to incorporate some of those extra little branches, but I don't want to overdo it, so there we have it. Now, for step 16, we are essentially just going to be balancing the greenery. So, much like I sped up the footage with the grass on the left-hand side, I figured we'd do that here again as well. In this process, I am really just crafting more of those leaves, kind of spawning in different directions. We are going in with slightly different values, slightly different hues. Some are brighter, some are darker, some are more green, while some of them lean towards a blue or a yellow. I'm also still trying to let the ones on the outskirts be more of a brighter color because they are going to be receiving slightly more light. The farther you get into these areas of foliage, the more shadows that they can kind of cast upon themselves. So the darker they should get while they get closer towards the ground, unless they're kind of sprawling out and they're very wide so that nothing really overlaps and the sun can kind of hit everything. That is very much up to you and your artistic liberties. However, I decided to make mine really quite dark because I wanted to work in some additional plants around these areas, and they'll stand out much better if that initial dark base layer, kind of lets those lighter layers stand out. So with that, here I'm going in with one of my custom smaller brushes, which I did cut. I ended up cutting two of them just so I had a little bit of variance. One is slightly wider, and it's working out quite great here for this area. This is essentially the smaller version of what we were painting in the foreground over in the right-hand side, and here I am grabbing some titanium white to create a little bit of a brighter color for this. Now, this is going to be applied on the top / left-hand side because, again, the light is coming from the top / left-hand side. It's all very intuitive once you kind of get the general idea. And for now, I am avoiding painting over that tree area, though we will expand this over top that later on. You don't really want your foliage to look like it perfectly just, ends right when it gets to that tree. It's a little bit too convenient. You probably want to go back later on, introduce that overlap, and therefore have something that looks a bit more depth heavy. With that, I am now getting some of those highlights, bringing them up into our more original foliage at the top left-hand corner. Again, this is quite similar to the application to what we did over on the right-hand side. So we have these very sharp tips, and then as we kind of move in towards the stem and the body, we apply a little bit more pressure. We let that expand, and of course, these aren't perfectly straight. They have a little bit of an arch in them. They have a slight bend, and that way it looks like they're not very firm, but rather that they have a little bit of a movement, that the weight of the actual leaf is dragging itself down and therefore creating something that exists within gravity and, again, is much more natural. I truly wonder how many times I've said the term natural in this painting lesson, or perhaps organic. It's definitely been quite a few, but they're words that are just so inherently tied to what we're doing in so many of the processes, so many of the finalized aesthetics that we're really working to meet. So far, so good. I'm also having these kind of work them rather themselves in from the left-hand side, very much like we did on the right-hand side. That way it implies that there are these plants off screen, and it just makes us wonder what else is out there. It makes the scene itself so much more interesting on a subconscious level. And then I am going back into the middles and the left-hand side to add in a couple additional highlights. So we've just spent quite a bit of time working on some fairly detailed areas, and it's now time to take a little bit of a break, work on something a bit easier. So here we're taking our 1-inch flat-headed brush. we're grabbing quite a lot of our burnt umber, a little bit of our burnt sienna. We want this to be saturated but not hyper saturated, and we're going to create a darker base layer for that of our palm trees. I'm also going to start working in some Mars black because we do want it to be darker than that of the burnt umber, and we'll grab some titanium white as well because we don't want it to be too saturated. It's a darker base layer. We don't want it to stand out in the same way highlight would, and so we are desaturating it. We're making sure it's dark, but we're also making sure that it's nice and earthy. You can also see all of these dark little details in the reference photo. I'm just kind of tapping my brush on those different areas just to kind of ensure that we do have what we need. And here I'm going to start on the sides and then work my way inside all of these palm trees. It's also worth noting that these initial applications are going to look a lot brighter than what the pigment looked like on the actual palette, and that's because, again, acrylics are just so transparent, especially when your brush is fairly damp. This one is definitely fairly damp. I wanted those bristles to be very condensed, and as you can see, it leads to a layer which is going to require at least another application, probably 2 or 3. But the titanium white and the Mars black are going to help to thicken it. They are naturally much more thick pigments than your normal reds, blues, yellows, etc. So that is going to help us, but we are definitely going to have to go in a couple of times. I'm also working on these edges initially because, again, that's when the brush does have the most paint on it. It has the most water. It can produce the cleanest of applications, especially in longer strokes. So once I've done that, I work my way into the middle, very similar to the rest of our process. We did talk about this earlier with the foliage itself, but it's interesting how that translates to literally every subject. There are these very useful general rules in painting. You don't ever have to follow any of these rules. I mean, you can do what you'd like. You can make the paintings how you'd like in the way you'd like. That's what's so wonderful about art. It's a creative experience. But to kind of make things easier for ourselves, we can kind of come up with these generalized rules which act as shortcuts or general stepping stones to creating very well applied artwork. So with that, it is going quite well. We are now going up to the top area here, and I am trying to have small areas leaf off kind of in the same way we created leaves. So we start with an application in that larger body. We maybe apply a bit of pressure and then we relieve pressure as we get to the end, so we get that nice sharp application. It trails off, it looks very clean, and it's essentially the palm tree kind of folding over in those areas at the top where you normally have all of the foliage coming out. So it's really quite neat, and I am now going back in and mixing up significantly more paint. This isn't going to be a small amount here because we are going to cover all of it yet again for a second time. You can kind of see beyond the palette how it is thin. You can see the blue showing through different portions of it. You can even see some of the drawings, and I just want to ensure that it looks as thick as it possibly can so that it looks as natural as it possibly can. We won't see those brush strokes like we do right now, and it will get significantly darker because you won't have that white of the canvas showing through the paint. You'll just see the paint, and that's often, I think, an issue a lot of newer people have with acrylics. They say, you know, I mix this color on my palette and it doesn't look the same on the painting, and that's just because it's relatively thin. You can see the white of the canvas showing through, and so you're getting a distorted view of what that color is. But if you added more paint or let that paint dry, then went back and added more paint, then you would finally see that proper color that you do see on your palette rendered as you'd like it. But I'm just going to finish up doing this second layer. I'll probably do a third, and then we'll move on. So we were able to have a little bit of a break there with the initial base layer of our palm tree, but now that that's dry, it's time to incorporate some details. I'm going to be doing so with the smaller round pointed brush. This one again is about 1/8 of an inch, and here I'm working a little bit of Mars Black into some burnt sienna and burnt umber. Then I'm going to test it in the shadows of our palm tree and almost immediately realize that it's too saturated. So I work in some titanium white, as I know that will desaturate our pigment, but then I also work in some Mars Black to ensure that it isn't too bright. Then from there we go back to our testing, and I love that. I think that it's nice, it's warm, it's a little bit warmer than what we have on the reference photo, but I'm very happy with that. So here I'm going to start applying it to the left hand side of my palm trees, and I'm going to do so initially with a myriad of vertical strokes. However, once I have the majority of the paint off of my brush, I'm going to start working to the right hand side. I'm going to do so with a very minimal amount of pressure, and the goal here is to get this paint to wrap around that tree. So that light is hitting that left hand side and then it wraps around. You start to establish that depth on that subject, make it three-dimensional, and I also note that I'm going into this with very little pressure because I want that granular effect that we rendered in the sand. I want that texture. I want something that feels and looks very tactile. So I'm trying to allow some of that darker base layer to show through, and I also want that pigment to dissipate as we move towards that right, so again we do get that slightly textured gradient from light to dark. And as you can see, I think it's going very well thus far. I'm heading down, and the farther down I get, the more I do want that paint to dissipate, because again, we are starting to get into that zone where the foliage is going to cast a bit of a shadow on this. If even only a light one, it is going to have an impact. So here I am just letting that paint run out rather than going back to my palette and grabbing more. With that, I do then add up back to the top of our palm tree, and this is something that is going to require a number of layers. This isn't our one and only highlight. We are going to build this up over a longer series, but I do think it's worth noting that we should start with this color. We should paint the entirety of the tree with it, and then we can move on to the next one. That way it still looks cohesive when we get towards the end. That said, I am starting to run into a little bit of an issue, and I want you to look at the painting right now. I want you to think if you can kind of articulate where that is. It's no issue with the color itself, but rather the application. We have a very slight area, a very slight line of the base layer showing up on the left hand side of our highlights, and it almost looks like it's drawn in, like we have these lines surrounding the tree. We don't want that. Whenever you're painting light on one side of a subject, make sure that you are slightly expanding on top of that initial base layer. That way it doesn't look like there's this slightly dark area, and it's something that I do go back and fix a little bit later on, but it's definitely something that happens to all of us regardless of how long we've been painting for. Whenever I do art reviews and critiques, it's definitely something that stands out, again, regardless of the skill level of the painter. It's just so easy to overlook. So make sure when you're doing things like this, when you're applying light to the left or the right hand side, that no portion of the base layer is showing through and that it is truly quite bright. That said, we are now moving up to the top of our palm trees, and we're working on some pretty detailed, interesting areas. These, of course, are the areas that kind of flop down from what is normally going to be the actual foliage, and they're a lot of fun to paint. It's a lot like painting very elongated leaves. We're highlighting the top and left-hand side because, again, we are following those same rules of lighting in our space, and it's going to look a little bit rough for a little while, but we definitely bring it to a nice space, again, as you probably did see in the thumbnail of this video. But here I'm trying to keep the majority of those highlights on the left hand side. Occasionally I am moving them over to the right if I do feel like an area is going to protrude, if it's going to catch more light, and of course in that scenario it's only going to occur on the left hand side of that protruding subject on the right hand side. I know that probably sounded a little bit convoluted, but I hope it makes sense, and if you play it back I think it will. That said, I'm essentially just going back and doing more of the same over on the left-hand area, and then I mix a slightly brighter variant. This just has slightly more titanium white in it, maybe a little bit more of our burnt sienna, but it's also slightly more saturated, so that burnt sienna will help in this scenario. And I'm just building up areas that really should be receiving the most amount of light. And at this point, we now have a dark base layer, we have a middle value hue, and we have a highlighted value in hue. So we have three things, and generally those three are enough to very well imply lighting and how it's working in a world. You can continue, you can build more on top of that, you can continuously go over, you can do hundreds. And, you know, we definitely do spend more time building it up here, but just in general, those three layers with that system works extremely well. Here I am also going to go down and do the bottom one. Again, same technique, and yours can look different here. I just thought painting it 3 times and explaining the same thing 3 times probably wasn't the best use of our time. So with that, we are now going back to our palette. You are seeing me mix up a brighter variant, and yet again testing it on my reference photo. I do think the reference photo was a little bit more bright than what I personally wanted to render, so my mix in the end here isn't going to be as bright as what's shown there, but something that is fairly close, and I really like what we have in this mix right here. Again, a lot of titanium white. You can see the different variations, and that's also great because if you try one of them on your canvas, then you know you have 2 or 3 other pre-mixes already available, and it's not a lot of paint. This is more meant to be an exploratory process where we try different amounts of each color, and this is definitely something I'd recommend, especially if you're not working from a reference photo. If you're kind of working off your own idea and having fun with it, then do try to make different mixes and just kind of see what you can come up with, what works well. Now, you can also see here that I have my pinky finger out, which might seem a little bit strange, but when you're working, you can kind of, over time, especially if you forget to have lunch or whatever meal is kind of revolving around your painting, you can kind of get a little bit shaky. I know that I can. So what I try to do in those scenarios is I put my pinky finger out, I ground it on a dry area of canvas, takes that shake out, and it just makes applying very detailed applications like this significantly easier. I don't do it through the entirety of the process, as you can see, but if anybody else kind of struggles with that, or if you find that, you know, maybe you just had too much coffee in that painting process and, you know, you lose a little bit of that control, then just grounding your hand in that way can be really efficient. And because acrylics dry so quickly, the majority of your canvas is going to be dry at all times, so you have a lot of real estate to kind of plant that finger and just ensure that, you know, you're in a strong position. Here I am going back, adding that highlight, and yet again I make that mistake. Look at that very subtle dark line on the edge of our palm tree. Here we go back, we do fix it, but for a second there, I watching back at it, I saw it and I was like, you know what, we all do it. We all do it frequently, and it's, you know, just something to keep in the back of our heads. I don't think it's any real indication of skill, just more mindfulness and how much time you're really spending with the painting. So if you are working on a piece like this and you intend to sell it, try to make sure that those edges are as clean as they can be for the buyer, and that, you know, it really does show that you've put that time in and you've been pretty meticulous with it. Here though, we are now going in with another highlight. Like I said, we already had 3 layers in this area, but we can do more than 3. We can do 4, we can do 5, and I am trying to match this highlight to that of what we have down in the base of the palm tree, trying to keep it all very cohesive. So this is something I'm incorporating again with that smaller custom brush that we made. And I noted, I think very quickly, that I actually made multiple, and I would recommend making multiple different sizes. Again, they don't have to be made of great brushes. These are just very cheap synthetic brushes. I'm a big fan of synthetic brushes, by the way, for a number of reasons. I get that question occasionally, not that often, but if you've ever wondered, that is definitely where I stand with painting. And just the option that is out there, because there is a lot of option. If you've ever been to a big art store and you've been through the brush aisles, you know that it can almost be a little bit daunting initially. And I've always felt that while different brushes can very much aid the process, I I don't have a lot of brand loyalty. I think that there are a lot of great options out there. I think that there are a lot of great affordable options out there. Just, see what you like, try different packs. Even cheaper brands like Artist Loft produce some quality synthetic brushes that honestly last for years if you take care of them. So again, don't feel like you have to go into there and buy 10 or 15 $20 brushes that then I'm going to ask you to cut up. No, it's okay to buy the pack of 10 brushes for $7 and cut a couple of those up. I certainly did here. That noted, on the note of brushes, we are switching back to our smaller round pointed brush. This one, again, is about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm mixing up more of our browns. We have some Mars Black, a little bit of our burnt umber, burnt sienna, titanium white, and the mixture right now is definitely more so on the gray side, and we want that. We want a very dark, nice grayish brown, because we're now going to start incorporating some details into the tree via some horizontal strokes that you can see right there. This application is actually very similar to how one would paint a birch tree. If you've ever watched any of my lessons on those before, we're going to mirror that kind of application process where we start with a very minimal amount of pressure. So we get a nice sharp tip on that initial application. We apply slightly more pressure, and then we relieve pressure again as we go to exit the canvas and lift our hand off. So it's actually very similar to the leaf application, but here we are going for much more of an elongated stroke rather than when we were working with the leaves, in which case we had these movements that kind of moved up or down. These are, again, much more horizontal for the most part and a bit wider. Though there, I actually made a marking and it wasn't as dark, just the Mars Black kind of ran out in the mix on my brush. And I like that a lot. I like that variance. I think that those little changes are going to add a lot to the piece, and all of these applications are different sizes. I'm doing some of them on the left hand side, some of them on the right hand side. There's a lot of variance in here. You can see even closer up that we are now moving on to the other tree, and I'm also trying to keep the spacing different. Again, diversity, 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 so important when creating art and making all of these things look natural. You want to take those kind of human-made elements out and ensure that it does look natural. Here I'm going in with that smaller custom brush and yet again working in some of the highlights, some of the darker applications. This is with a highlight, and I'm just going back and forth until we get something that looks very textured, very detailed. We have a lot of paint layered on there, and this is the foreground. This is the area that's very close to us, that we can see all of this detail, that we can see these very minute changes in colors. In the background, we had to stay very reserved, right? We needed to be very conservative with our applications, with our saturation, with our contrast. But here, we have an opportunity to really build it up. And I wanted to show you this up close so you could see just how much we were adding. Though when we step back, it doesn't look like too much. I'm always, taking 5 or 6 steps back from the canvas, just ensuring that, okay, well, that looks balanced. We don't have too much there. We might need a little bit more. And here I have arguably the brightest pigment that I've used, just using some little taps, not covering the entirety of the side, but, picking specific areas, dragging it out in very choice spots. And this is also going to dissipate as we get towards the bottom, because again, that is where you get the shadows from the foliage. So once we finish with the base of the palm tree, we're going to start moving on to the foliage, otherwise known as the fronds. And here we're going to start by just mixing up a darker base layer, very similar to that of what we had in the grass and the foliage. And I am using the round pointed brush to do so. This one again is about 1/4 of an inch. However, as you can probably tell, this one's a little bit different from the one we were using earlier in the lesson, because someone being me, made the mistake of leaving their brush out overnight without washing it, and when I woke up, it was simply no more. So this is your friendly reminder to wash your brushes when you're done with them, and sometimes even in between your painting sessions if you feel like you're going to put a brush down for an hour or so. That said, once I have all of that pigment mixed up there, I am switching to a smaller round pointed brush, one of the ones that we cut ourselves, and I'm going to start working on the spine of the fronds. Now, I decided to mix that pigment with a larger brush because it's much easier to mix pigment when you have more surface area on the brush. What we're working with right now just wouldn't accomplish much in any reasonable amount of time. Once you finally had a good mix, the paint would probably dry on your palette. So in those scenarios, I would recommend working with a larger brush for the mixing process and then actually applying it with a smaller one. Here though, we are again starting with the farthest point in the frond, the spine of it, then we work our way back into the actual tree. We allow our brush stroke and our pressure to increase a little bit so that it gets wider, and then maybe it gets a little bit smaller as we get back into that base. That again is a very common technique. We used it for a lot of the leaves. We used it for just so many different applications, but understanding pressure with your brush can be incredibly useful throughout the entirety of the painting process. Here we're also applying these what initially looks like to the left and right hand side with some going straight up. That isn't actually how this is going to work. Some of them are going to be moving towards us, some of them are going to be moving away from us, with some of course on the left and right hand side. Just remember that when you're painting these, that they don't essentially work on a single axis of the tree, and that we do want some of them to be moving in very dynamic ways. That of course won't actually occur until we're working on all of the little offshoots, but we will get to that rather soon. Here we are just getting in that base and making the painting look a little bit awkward for a period of time, but that really is just the cost of working with acrylics. And you know, it kind of makes the process really fun because you get this challenge, you have something to overcome, and then when you do get it to look the way you want, you feel incredibly relieved, right? So I don't know, it definitely makes the painting process quite interesting. Here I am starting to create those offshoots though. I'm beginning at the far right hand side, and then I start to work my way to the left. I'm leaving relatively large openings between all of these applications, and I'm also going to go back over previous applications and thicken things because we are working with acrylics. They are inherently fairly thin, and we do want to ensure that we have these strong applications. So here, as you can see, I'm going over these spots 2, maybe 3 times. Sometimes I will miss. Sometimes I'll be slightly more to the left, slightly more to the right, and that will cause an extra stroke. But that actually isn't a bad thing because initially we are purposefully leaving space in between each of our applications. And what I want to do here, and what I'd implore you to do here, is in this process, start by incorporating a minimal amount of these offshoots, apply it to all of the different spines on the tree, and then once you have that, start expanding on all of them at once. Because if we were to do one of these and bring it to completion, if we were to, make it as full as we possibly could, then we'd essentially be locked into that amount of fullness for the rest of them, and we might not want that. It might be too much when we're doing a lot of them. It might look great on one, but it might look overbearing if, we're painting 8 or 9 of them. So we're going into this with a very minimalistic application, or leaving spaces, and for that reason, these are going to look a little bit young for a shorter period of time, and then they'll kind of grow up as we add more of the foliage and more of the offshoots throughout this process. That said, here I am making it a bit more three-dimensional by adding in not the offshoots on the right hand side, but the ones on the left hand side. It's important to recognize that when you're doing this, you don't want them to essentially just come down in a single trajectory, because there are 2 sides to this and they're going to overlap slightly. So I try to make one side of it have a fairly similar bend curve trajectory, a similar spacing in between each, and then the one that's going to be behind, or the other one, it kind of crisscrosses a little bit, and it consistently does that. So there is a lot of a pattern there, so it doesn't look not clean, but it definitely overlaps in a really beautiful way. And we'll talk about that more as we kind of continue to work on these here. But as you've probably noticed, we've been working on this little area for quite a while now. And I would like to kind of let you know from the get-go here, this is going to take some time. And that's not a bad thing. It's very cathartic, it's very fun. But I probably spent a couple of hours just working on these little pieces. And you know, we do speed up some of the footage later on so that this again isn't like a 10-hour video, but recognize that when you go into this, you probably going to want some time, or you're going to want to break it up into multiple painting sessions. That said, here again, I am going over those areas yet again, and something else worth noting that's quite prominent right now, I try to make both the offshoots quite short at the back and the front of the spine. So the area that connects to the tree and the area that is farthest away from it are generally the areas that have the smallest, least long portions, where when we get to the middle, that's when it's very extended. You kind of have that drooping effect, and it's good to kind of keep that in mind because it's a general pattern that again will keep these from feeling messy in the end or from feeling a little bit boring. If you kind of had this very flat movement, it just wouldn't look great. So with that, here we are incorporating those arches. We're starting to fill things in minorly, and I'm quite happy with that initial application there. With that said, here we are now going back and we're incorporating the other side. So I'm choosing a slightly different trajectory. It has more of an angle to it, and I'm crisscrossing with a bunch of our previously applied extended pieces, and I think it's really starting to look quite good. Here are a couple very clean, very sharp strokes, as you can see, and now that's how we build depth without actually adding light or additional applications, which we will do, but there are many steps to adding that depth. And here with those final strokes, you can see the full shape kind of come to fruition and how that's really meant to look. Anyways, I just got back from a little bit of a water break, and I wanted to take this time to remind you to stay hydrated. We mentioned it earlier in the lesson, but I think that it's something that's incredibly important, especially when we are painting fronds like these, because these will take you hours. They definitely took me hours, and it's good to just, remember to have some food, have some water, and just be in a good place, because you can definitely lose yourself in this part of the painting. And, on that note, I found, especially this year with all of us kind of being in lockdown, having the opportunity to paint, to sit down and kind of immerse yourselves in these settings, it's been so cathartic. It's been so needed. I know that I myself and a lot of people end up getting cabin fever. So especially here in the summer, being able to still experience these settings through the painting process has been huge. And portions like this in the painting that really just make you sink hours into them, it helps in a really wonderful way. So while I hope that you are remembering to, have some food, have some water, some tea, that you're also just kind of getting lost in the painting, the process, losing time, and just enjoying the setting. Because, right now we can't necessarily go to these places. It isn't responsible, but we will one day, and it's kind of nice to just daydream and create these beautiful settings that we do intend to go to again. That said, I would also like to use this part of the video, because again, we're doing a lot of repetition right here, to say a big thank you to everybody who does support the channel up over on Patreon. It is because of you that I can spend 10 hours painting something like this, that we can do these incredibly detailed lessons, and that I don't just have to put up the first thing that I work on every week, that I can actually do a painting 2 or 3 times, so that I can perfect the process and pass on to you information that I'm very confident in and very proud of. So thank you for allowing me to make these lessons for a living. Thank you for providing these lessons for everybody up on YouTube who perhaps can't afford to support the channel up over on Patreon. But I wanted to let you know that what you do there, it makes a massive impact. I truly appreciate it. and I'm only able to do this and do lessons like this because of you. So thank you so much. And again, I'd especially love to have your input on the format of this lesson. Again, this is done with a voiceover rather than recording it in real time. I'd love your opinion on that. I'd love your opinion on, kind of speeding up some of the repetitive parts, because I am very happy to adapt these lessons and make them really what you want them to be. This lesson was an attempt to break them into parts and make it as digestible as possible, to ensure that, if you were kind of struggling with an area, you knew exactly what that area was. You could revisit it. It was kind of easy to find in the video. It was differentiating itself from everything else. And again, I wanted to make this a bit of a higher production value and continue to, as a thank you for, again, letting me do this. I want the paintings to get better, I want the videos to get better, and I fully intend to make both of those things happen for you. So thank you for supporting the channel and letting me teach art for a living. It's a real pleasure. If you are new to the channel, you can also support the channel up over on Patreon. It is how we do what we do. It's how we keep the lights on. And up there, you can get a bunch of fun things like the traceables for the lessons. You can get the reference photos. We do a lot of color matching in this specifically, and I'll be doing a lot of that in the future. Up there, you can also get instant access to all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. In it, we talk about what brushes to use, how to work with water, how to glaze, how to work with your compositions, how to do different styles of blending. Really, again, everything you need to know. Up there, you can also get access to our exclusive Facebook group where we all share artwork, talk about things, and it's really just, it's a great supportive community with people who are working on similar pieces. So you can get a lot of neat ideas for things that you're working on. You can share your ideas, and we can all kind of grow and become better together in a very positive environment. I've actually felt like I've learned a lot from quite a number of the members. I feel like someone who hasn't posted in a while, and I'm going to call you out in this one. I know you're incredibly busy, Kyle Goody, but Kyle Goody posts some incredible artwork of mountains up there, and I feel like it always inspires me. He works on these grand, large canvases, and again, he hasn't posted up there in a while because of a couple of really cool reasons. But yeah, Kyle, I just wanted to say again, if you're listening to this, if you made it this far in this one, you inspire me, and I think a lot of members up there inspire each other. So if you want access to that specific Facebook group, you can get that through Patreon, along with the reference photos, the traceables, the ebooks, all of that fun stuff. Also, I'm looking at the footage again. Here I have a fan brush. I cut this fan brush. As you can see, there are little areas that are out of it, and I'm going to use this to render multiple strokes at once. This is just like how we were painting the previous applications. However, now we are getting 5 or 6 applications rather than 1. It greatly increases the speed of the process, but I didn't want to start with this because I wanted much more control in creating the initial applications, where they were, the structure, the length. You definitely do give up control when you're working with this, and I think it makes it a great additional piece to it, but it's not something you want to necessarily start with, right? Because you want to make sure that all of the movements are exactly how you want, and then when it comes time to fill it out, to add all of these extra applications, that's when this becomes fantastic. Again, you don't need a very expensive fan brush. I know I'm cutting a lot of brushes in this video. We peeled back the bristles on another, but I really am a big fan of making the tools that I specifically want, and I'd implore you to do so as well with some relatively inexpensive synthetic brushes. Here you can see I'm also taking those extended pieces of the fawns, moving them upwards, and then I bring them back down. That way it has this nice droop effect again. And I also really wanted to incorporate some applications at the top. So here we have an implied piece of foliage, which is again over top of us. It creates a much more real setting, and it also gives the painting a slightly vignetted effect, which is also really great because it draws the eye into the middle of the painting. Here I'm also taking that small pointed brush that again we rendered, and I'm bringing in some of these fawns to the tree. That way they start in different areas. You can see that some actually exist in front. They don't all kind of move off to the side. Some are behind, and it's a very easy way to add some additional depth with these and make them feel very cohesive within this whole area. We very quickly went from doing a lot of the same application to doing some very new different things. But again, I didn't mean to cut the conversation on Patreon too short. Again, a big thank you to everybody who's up there, and there's a link to it in the description if you're interested in everything we talked about. That said, on to the next step. Once we've applied our base layer, it's time to start building some depth via light in the same way we did with the foliage. So I'm going to take some of our cadmium yellow deep hue, some of our cerulean blue, quite a bit of titanium white, and a small hint of Mars black as well. This is going to give us a nice kind of mid-value, mid-hue green, and I'm testing that on the reference photo. I think it's working quite well, but I also want something a little bit brighter. So here I'm going to start making a second mixture. This one is going to have more titanium white in it, and now we'll have essentially a series of highlights that we can add and play with. This also works quite well in a number of areas because not all highlights are made equal, and you are going to want that variance. Here I am going back to that fan brush. I'm essentially going to start at the top, and then I work my way down, relieving pressure as we go ahead and do that. Now, I think that we may initially misinterpret just how much this can apply. I know that when I made it for those later applications, I was like, oh, for the highlights, it's going to make it so quick and easy. You still need to do quite a few applications, as you can see. I'm continuously going back and grabbing more of that pigment. And it's also worth noting that you do want to keep your brush quite damp, if not almost wet for this process, because you want those bristles to be as tight together as they can possibly be. And you really want the pigment to be able to dissipate as you lift that brush off the canvas as well. So here I think again great examples of how the applications closest to the spine are really the largest, and then they get smaller and smaller as we move out towards the edges. I also occasionally rotate my brush so that I use both sides. Sometimes you end up having paint on both sides, and when you only apply from one, you don't end up getting the paint on the back. Then when you go to grab more paint, you end up just kind of overloading the brush. So I'm trying to be relatively careful here and use essentially all that I have. Now I am starting to get farther back, and this is a scenario where you have a couple of different options. You could opt to make it brighter. Maybe this tree is farther out, it isn't getting any shade from the trees above, or maybe it's, more so underneath and it's getting more shade. Again, lots of artistic liberties, and you can kind of decide how you want yours to look, but I'd recommend trying to create a little bit of a gradient in the very least in terms of where the brighter extended pieces are. I'm also now going to go in with the smaller brush and work that highlight onto the spine of the fawns. We're also working that down into the actual tree, and I want this highlight to be brighter than the extended pieces. That way we have a notable area, a visual kind of place to move through. It doesn't feel overcomplicated. It actually stands out, but not too much. It's still, within the kind of set greens of the painting, and it doesn't become overly distracting. It's just noticeably different and therefore not messy. So I am working this over a couple of them, and it's also worth noting that I'm trying to make certain areas brighter than others. When I get closer to the tree itself, I let it dissipate, I let it get darker. When I'm more so in that real bend, more so kind of closer to the top, that is where I let it be brighter, because that area is going to be receiving more light. I also move some of those highlights out to the right and left, but I don't do too much, kind of just enough to ensure that we are getting a good progress and that it does feel relatively full. Again, I think that when I end up looking at all of the different variations that people render from this, I think that their trees are going to look very different. Some of us are going to want them to be very full. Some of us are going to want them to be a bit more open and airy. I don't think there's anything wrong with either of those, and I'd implore you to make yours the way you really like to, and just have fun with it. Live in the world that you're creating, right? If you want to see these fawns with just a myriad of these little extended pieces, then do it. But if you want it to be a bit more, again, airy, you can see the sky, then go ahead and do that as well. Here I am moving up in the painting. We are again using the fan brush, the cut fan brush, to do this, but I would like to remind you that you are going to want to mix the paint here with the round pointed brush or one of the flat headed brushes, because mixing the paint with a fan brush, it wouldn't be a good time. Again, it would probably dry before you were able to really accumulate any real amount of pigment. With that, here I am moving up to the top area, and I'm being very meticulous with this actually. I was trying to go over the areas that were pre-established. I wasn't trying to create brand new spots, and I just wanted a highlight on those previously applied little extended pieces. Here I'm also now going back and adding more of those spines, and I just think that it is really wonderful how this is turning out. It's one of those things that looks a little barren, and then it looks a little messy, and then it looks a little perfect, and it all just kind of comes together. There are so many paintings, there are so many subjects where I feel like for the first 85% I ask myself, what am I doing? And then it all just works. And I think that's because I very much like to paint all of the details at the end for most of the subjects. That way nothing is kind of overdone at any point. It doesn't force me to overdo anything else. But it's just a friendly reminder that if it's not perfect right now, just keep going. You can get it there. You can make it happen. You can learn. You can apply the right strokes. And if something goes wrong, it's okay. It's acrylics. You can cover them up. You can go over them. Here, I decided to go over some of the other fawns. As you can see, I'm redoing those darker base layers. I'm redoing those highlights so that this area is truly in front. It's closest to us. And I'm actually using a brighter green for this than I did for the fawns behind. So with our highlights applied to our palm trees, with everything looking full three-dimensional, like it has this beautiful sun on it, it's time to take a step back from our painting and start touching things up, adding other little elements that we might have missed earlier or wanted to implement, but it just wasn't the right time. For instance, here I'm expanding some of the foliage from that greenery on top of our palm tree. That way it pushes the palm tree back a little bit in the painting. It creates this extra level of depth. And then I decided to create another fairly similar little piece of greenery. This time, however, it's going to be planted in the sand, and it's going to overlap the grass and the palm tree, again creating additional levels of depth and creating a very cohesive look with a similar piece quite close to it. They're not the exact same, they're not the exact same size, they don't have the exact same movements, but they're similar, and they make this area look a bit more believable and realistic. So I start there with that nice base layer, then I do go ahead and start mixing something a little bit brighter. We have our cadmium yellow deep hue, our cerulean blue, we have our titanium white, and now we're mixing up a nice but subtle highlight. It's also worth noting, we haven't talked about this yet, I'm using the cadmium yellow deep hue for this painting because it's a fairly warm yellow, and I wanted something nice and warm for these greens. I wanted something that felt like summer, felt like it had sun on it. So that's why we went with the cadmium deep hue over something like a primary yellow or a lemon yellow. You could use those, but recognize that you're just going to get a little bit more warmth with that option there. With that said though, this section is really just meant to be personal. It's about what area you'd like to touch up, what area you'd like to go back to. Maybe you want to add some extra highlights in the water. Maybe you want to add some extra texture in the sand. You have a much better idea of how you want the piece to look. And now that the palm trees are implemented, you have all that detail, that highlight. You might want to add more of a stark contrast somewhere. You might want to make something look more subtle. This is when you take those steps back and you just work on things and touch them up how you want to. Here, for instance, I am currently just going in, creating a nice sandy color, very much in line with the shadows that we previously established. And this is actually going to be a shadow for a lot of the grass because, again, that sun, it is on the left-hand side. It is casting shadows to the right. And we're going to have all of this grass that does cast these shadows. You can see it with a little bit of our other grass. You can see it with that palm tree. We talked about it probably an hour and a half ago, but here we're just remembering to do all of those little pieces. I'm back to the finger painting, just ensuring that it's nice and soft, and I love just how much that adds to a painting. I think it's absolutely wonderful. But with that said, that right there is going to conclude our painting for the day. So if you've made it this far, congratulations. Thank you for spending this time here with me. I think it's wonderful that people are still interested in the traditional medium of painting and acrylics. You know, even in such a digital age where you can do so much on the computer, I think it's wonderful that you are here keeping this medium alive and making what you are. I hope that you are finding a lot of success. I hope that you are excited. I hope you feel like you learned a lot and that you really enjoyed the process here. Again, big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon who literally makes this happen, who allows me to do this. I will be working on some of the other lessons that recently did quite well in the last Patreon poll. So thank you to everybody who voted in that. We have some really nice seascapes and forest scenes coming up. And again, just thank you for being here, whether you're on Patreon or not. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love doing this. I love having these chats and making the lessons that we do. I'm not sure if you can tell. I've been talking for about 2.5 hours and getting a little tongue twisted, but I think it's nice that we can kind of end things on a less professional level. Just, you know, two people talking about art, having fun. And yeah, it was such a pleasure. I love how this turned out. Painting while listening to music or podcasts, I definitely find that I'm better at it than painting while explaining things. But again, if you feel like the lessons are better or more enjoyable when I'm painting and talking in real time, let me know, and I'd be happy to get back to that as well if the majority of people kind of feel that way. So let me know in the comments. And I always like to include a secret word, a secret phrase at the end of these videos that you can leave in the comments if you've made it this far. It's kind of a little badge of honor. Everybody who got this far all know that, you know, you're someone who's truly dedicated to the craft, and you're probably going to end up with a pretty great painting. So the code word or phrase today is sunny days. You can say it once, you can say it twice, but that's what I had in my head. That's what this painting makes me think about. So find a way to incorporate that in your comment down below. I'll know that you made it this far. Everybody else will, and it'll be a little fun badge of honor. I love seeing the people who kind of repeatedly find these things. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, thank you for being here. And again, if you are new to the channel, we do this hopefully every week. Sometimes it's every other week, just because I do occasionally do the paintings 2 to 3 times just to get them as good as I can. But if you are new, remember you can support the channel up on Patreon. You can get the traceables, the ebooks, the reference photos, the exclusive Facebook group, access to the polls, bunch of fun things. And again, it does directly support the channel. So thank you for being here. I hope you have a wonderful painting experience, and I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson. So again, stay hydrated, and above all, as always, stay creative.